Okay, guys, I want to start off this video just very quickly going over a couple of things that I really had to rush through at the end of the last video, because I was pressed for time that the limit was going to expire. So I kind of really sped through everything at the end very, very quickly. And I just want to make sure that we're clear on a couple of things. Judaism, Zoroastrianism, very important in the big scheme of things of the history of world religions because they are monotheistic. And that is a huge deal compared to the ancient religions, which were all polytheistic. The idea of one God that is all controlling and omnipotent and omniscient. Omnipotent means all powerful. Omniscient means all knowing. Ancient religions and even a lot of other classical religions, they broke their gods down into different aspects. You had a god of the sun, a god of the moon, a god of nature, a god of the afterlife. Judaism and Zoroastrianism, later Christianity, Islam, that one monotheistic God, that was everything. That was all one. They were all knowing, all seeing, and so forth. So that's a big deal. But the other thing I really wanted to focus on was the morality. Right? You see that with the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. It's not just about breaking the laws of man. It's about breaking the laws of God. And that's a big, big difference. You don't see that in religions, in other polytheistic religions. You don't see that in other law codes. Okay, Hammurabi's code was about breaking the laws of man, not breaking the laws of God. So that's a very, very distinct difference between the two. And it's important to keep in mind. And the idea that really comes from Zoroastrianism about some type of consequences for your actions carrying over into the afterlife, be they good or bad. That would be very influential, particularly in Christianity, within the creation of the concept of heaven or hell. So make sure you remember that part as well, the morality that goes into it. All right, let's get into economies. Now, economy is kind of a very, very broad term. Essentially, it's what deals with money, the transfer of money, the running of money by the government, private businesses, private ownership, and so forth. And as these societies begin more complex, it leads to what we call increased social stratification. Now, stratification means it's similar to a hierarchy, right? That you've got very, very defined levels to it, and some are very clearly high, and some are very clearly low. You look at the pyramid, the social pyramid that I showed you guys earlier, and a couple of videos ago of the Egyptian society with the pharaoh up top and so forth. And if you notice, the elites up at the top, right? These are your elites, from royalty all the way down to soldiers. Even scribes would be included in there because literacy was such a valuable commodity at that time. They were very small. Right? The higher you go on the pyramid, the less you get in size, but the higher you get in power. The lower you go, the greater you get in overall size and population, but the lower you get in power, status, and overall wealth. So that's important to remember, that the elites controlled an awful lot. Down at the bottom, you do have slaves, and I just wanted to mention one or two things about slaves here. Slavery in the ancient world was a little different from how we kind of, learn about it in American history. American slavery was very much a black and white issue. It was based on race. Slavery throughout the ancient world, and really throughout most of human history, wasn't that clearly defined. You weren't born into a slave because you were born into a certain race. Usually you resulted in being a slave because of some circumstances. And the most common ones being POWs, right? Prisoners of war. Conquer a people, you take those people into slavery. This was practiced in Africa. This was practiced in China. This was practiced in these ancient Middle Eastern ones that we're talking about as well. Right? So there's one. Another one is this thing that we call indentured servitude. I'm not going to write out the whole thing. I'll let you write out servitude. Indentured servitude is where you sell yourself into slavery to pay off a debt. Okay. You owe somebody an awful lot of money. And, back in those days, the crime was usually death. And so you say, well, I will sell myself into slavery in order to pay that off. And so that my family will be taken care of and so forth. And the last one was criminals. If you commit some type of crime, The same way that indentured servitude, essentially they committed a crime and owing a debt. But whether you call it stealing or, something like that, they might give you an option. Not always, I don't know all these ancient legal codes well enough to know which ones would and which ones wouldn't, but some of them would give you the option that you could then pay off your debt to society or to that individual by being a slave. POWs probably made up the biggest one, and after that, indentured servants, and then criminals. One other aspect with these ancient societies is that you're seeing the early development of serfdom. Now, serfdom we talked about last year in the Middle Ages, where serfs, they're not quite slaves, but it's not much better than slaves. Serfdom is where you are tied to the land, where these people up here, the elites, they own the land, but they also essentially own the farmers that are working on the land. So if they sell land, if land is transferred from one noble to the next, it's not just the physical land and the crops that are transferred. It's also the people that work there. You're not paid in money. You're allowed to work to the land in order to support yourself and so forth. We'll talk more about that later, but you're starting to see the early developments of it during the ancient time. Okay, and the last thing to go over this one is trade. Now, trade, when you go back to the earliest times, you didn't really use money. Obviously they didn't have paper money back in this time, and even coinage was rare during the early days. So you used what we call a barter system. Barter system is where I give you one thing for another thing. You're not using currency. You're not using money in any way. As this stuff continues to develop, it leads to, hold on. Now I left one out. Okay. One thing that I want to include in there, I meant to include a picture in here, but I don't want to go back and restart the whole video. It led to, if you want to put something in here, marketplaces. A meeting area. Rather than having a bunch of door-to-door salesmen that go around and everybody acts like this, there needs to be a central meeting area, and these would develop into marketplaces. And that's, the word itself is carried over. You talk about the market. The market nowadays, we talk to stock markets and things like that. But you go to a lot of towns and, and even cities, and you've got areas. I mean, it's the same concept of as a shopping mall, an area where people can go and buy and sell things. All right. New transport. As trade increases, and people are moving around a lot. Now, we're not talking about, advanced transport with technology, but we're talking about the way that people go. This one here, you notice a lot of people all kind of moving together. We call these caravans. They were for safety. They were for security. And also you could transport more goods. And especially you got to remember the region that we're in right now. We're in a largely desert region where civilizations are very sporadic and separated. So if you're traveling from Egypt to Mesopotamia and onward into Central Asia, it was harsh climates. It was not very hospitable. So you needed to rely on human support. Going out and trading on your own wasn't always the smartest move. Key trade relations that you see at this time. Okay, a couple of regions. You have what we call regional. Okay, so Egypt to Nubia, we'll refer to this one as regional. Let's get rid of these first. Okay, so this one we'll say is regional, meaning you stay within the same region. Okay, Egypt to Nubia, you're just staying within here. And this was mostly centered around the Nile. And then the other one you have, which would be like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Indus, we call these interregional, meaning you are going from one region to the next. So you're going from Egypt and you're going over to Mesopotamia, the Mesopotamia to the Indus. Let me show you this. Let's get rid of these. Make sure you got this down here, okay, about regional and interregional. I'm going to take those down because this one has all of the trade routes in there for you. Okay, going from Mesopotamia, across what today would be Iran, in through, Afghanistan and Pakistan into the Indus River Valley. That was difficult to do. Yes, there were water routes and so forth, but shipbuilding was still somewhat in its infancy, and going over land was dangerous. It was tricky, but the payoff could be worth it. And what you see with this with trade, obviously trade is a big reason for cultural diffusion. Got to remember that. But also you're starting to see an increase of wealth. Certain areas that are along trade routes build in their wealth. And eventually we're going to see these trade routes develop more and more to the east until we see that Silk Road come all the way from China through the Middle East into the Mediterranean. And cities develop along trade routes. That was true in the United States in the modern era, and it certainly was true in the ancient world. More people, more business,